So, what if I told you that the average worker entering the labor market today is, statistically speaking, guaranteed to face 2.5 involuntary job losses over the course of their career?
Which is, yeah, that is a wild number.
Right. It's more than double the rate we saw back in the 1990s.
Yeah.
So the modern employment contract isn't just, a little fractured. It is fundamentally broken.
And honestly, that underlying instability, it really explains why over 65% of the workforce right now is actively running some sort of side hustle or secondary income stream
Yeah, exactly.
because nobody trusts the floor beneath them anymore, right? So everyone is just independently hedging their bets.
They have to. Well, today on the Deep Dive, we are pulling from a really comprehensive paper by Dr. Jonathan H. Westover. It's titled The Great Decoupling, Rebuilding Trust in the Modern Workplace.
That's a fantastic paper.
It really is. And our mission today is to figure out the actual mechanics of why the fundamental relationship between you and your employer feels so hostile these days.
Right. And then we're going to explore how the smartest organizations on the planet are actively reversing this trend, because doing so gives them a massive competitive advantage.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because whether you are, an entry-level employee scanning the job boards, or maybe a gig worker hustling between platforms, or even a CEO trying to retain top talent, you have definitely felt this shift.
Oh, 100%.
It's that sinking sort of visceral feeling that your company essentially views you as just a disposable line item on a spreadsheet.
Yeah, and we really have to recognize that this feeling, it isn't just some cultural vibe or, a temporary post-pandemic hangover.
Right.
Dr. Westover's research actually documents a measurable 6-decade-long dismantling of the core psychological and economic contract between organizations and their workforces.
6 decades, that's a long time.
Exactly. We're looking at a huge systemic structural shift in exactly how human labor is valued.
Well, before we can look at the companies that are actively fixing this, I think we need to define the exact mechanics of what broke.
That makes sense.
Because the numbers here, they paint a pretty stark reality. Trust in organizational leadership has plummeted to an abysmal 19%.
Which is just wild.
Right, and that's down from 25% just back in 2019.
Yeah, and overall employer trust is, it's hovering around 67%. But when you look specifically at frontline workers...
Who make up, 72% of the global workforce?
Exactly, 72%. When you look at them, that trust number just collapses even further.
Wow.
So the paper breaks this long-term decoupling down into 3 distinct, really measurable dimensions.
Okay, let's go through them.
The first one is psychological decoupling. Basically, this represents the erosion of the relational psychological contract.
The relational contract.
Yeah, so decades ago, employment was largely based on mutual loyalty. An employee offered hard work and dedication, and the organization reciprocated. They offered job security, predictable career advancement, and, internal development.
Like the gold watch at retirement kind of thing.
Exactly, the gold watch era. But today, that has been completely replaced by purely transactional exchanges.
Right, the new paradigm.
Yeah, the paradigm is now you give me labor for today, I give you wages for today, and literally neither of us owes the other a tomorrow.
Which is brutal. And that actually brings us to the second dimension, which is economic decoupling.
This one is huge.
It really is. It's this massive systemic transfer of financial risk away from the corporate entity and directly onto the shoulders of the individual worker.
Yeah.
I think the clearest example of the mechanics behind this is the transition from defined benefit pensions over to defined contribution 401k plans.
Oh, absolutely. Because under a defined benefit pension, right, a massive corporation with a huge pool of capital, they absorb the investment risk.
Yeah, they took the hit if things went south.
Exactly. If the stock market took a dive, the company had to figure out how to balance the books, but the retiree still received their guaranteed monthly check.
But with a 401k?
With a 401k, organizations structurally moved all of that market volatility, all that investment management burden, straight onto you, the individual.
Wow.
You went from being a protected stakeholder in a massive fund to basically an independent stock market speculator.
That is such a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And if you add in the shift from, comprehensive employer-funded healthcare over to high-deductible health savings accounts, the pattern is just impossible to ignore.
The worker absorbs the shocks.
Always. And then the third dimension, structural decoupling, that sort of locks this all in place, right?
Yeah, structural decoupling involves the broader regulatory and organizational environment. So, for example, union membership in the private sector dropped from roughly 30% in the 1950s down to about 10% today.
Wow. A 20-point drop.
Yeah, and mechanically, that completely neutralizes collective bargaining power. Combine that with the absolute explosion of contingent work.
You mean like the gig economy?
Exactly. Gig workers, independent contractors, you combine all that and you have a system designed from the ground up to absolutely minimize long-term corporate commitment.
Okay, but let me push back on the inherent gloominess of this data for a second.
Sure, go for it.
Isn't having well, a boundaryless career actually kind of empowering?
In what way?
Like, it gives the individual agency, right?
Hmm.
It feels like we moved from this restrictive 1950s marriage expectation where you were locked into one company forever, even if you hate it.
Right, the company man.
Exactly. We moved from that to treating our careers like a series of Tinder dates. We are constantly swiping for the next best thing, hopping to a new company for a 50% salary bump or, I don't know, cooler project. Doesn't that ultimate mobility give the worker the real power?
Well, that is definitely the narrative that's often sold to workers, that this fractured landscape is just a result of modern employees demanding ultimate freedom and flexibility.
Right, that's what you always hear on LinkedIn.
Exactly. But the research utterly refutes that. Yeah. This shift was not driven by workers organically seeking more precarious lives. I mean, who wants that? It was actually driven by aggressive macroeconomic and systemic changes that really began in the 1980s.
Okay.
The system structurally forced the risk onto the worker, and the boundaryless career was simply the necessary survival adaptation.
Oh, wow. So we didn't choose the Tinder date career model at all. The
Yeah.
marriage contract was basically unilaterally ripped up by the other party.
Exactly. Let's trace the actual drivers here. Beginning in the 80s, the corporate world fundamentally adopted the doctrine of shareholder primacy.
Right, maximizing shareholder value above all else.
Exactly. The singular overriding purpose of a corporation became maximizing short-term returns for shareholders.
Mm.
And within that specific financial framework, human labor was radically redefined.
How so?
Well, you were no longer considered a long-term asset to be cultivated. You were reclassified as a liability, essentially, a cost to be minimized.
Yeah.
The stock market actually began explicitly rewarding companies with immediate share price bumps the literal moment they announced large-scale layoffs.
That is a deeply unsettling reality to sit with. I mean, Wall Street literally popped champagne corks when tens of thousands of people lose their livelihoods.
Yeah, it turns human anxiety into a market indicator for profitability.
And then, obviously, you introduce the forces of globalization and technological change on top of that.
Oh, yeah. Trade liberalization agreements like NAFTA, along with China's entry into the World Trade Organization, those completely altered the labor market mechanics.
Because suddenly we're competing with everyone.
Exactly. Previously, sheltered domestic workers were suddenly thrust into direct competition with a massive global labor pool.
Right.
Capital and supply chains became incredibly fluid and globally mobile almost overnight, but labor remained geographically trapped.
Which makes sense. You can move a factory, but you can't easily move 10,000 families.
Right. And this global labor arbitrage allowed corporations to offshore routine, cognitive, and manual tasks to the cheapest possible markets, which heavily depressed domestic wages and bargaining power.
And the regulatory environment clearly followed suit, right? The paper notes that the federal minimum wage has remained frozen at $7.25 since 2009.
Since 2009, yeah.
From an impartial, purely systemic standpoint, that is the longest period without a statutory increase in U.S. history. That sends a pretty definitive signal about where worker welfare actually ranks in the broader economic formula.
Definitely.
But, if you were listening to this on your commute right now, you might be thinking, okay, global trade policy and the 1980s shareholder doctrines are interesting, but what does this actually have to do with my daily stand-up meeting? Or, why my specific department won't hire more help?
Right. Well, what's fascinating here is how mundane, seemingly neutral accounting rules actually dictate the everyday human behavior of your managers.
Okay, yes. I was reading this part of the source material, and it honestly blew my mind.
It's crazy, right?
It is. The mechanics of corporate bookkeeping are fundamentally biased against people.
Yeah.
In standard accounting, human labor is recorded as a period cost. It is categorized as an immediate expense that reduces the company's profits for that specific quarter.
Exactly.
But capital investments like buying an industrial robotic arm or a massive enterprise software suite, those are categorized differently.
They are assets.
Right. They're assets. The company can depreciate the cost of that software over 5 or 10 years. So if a middle manager is under intense pressure to hit a quarterly profit target, the literal tax code and the accounting ledgers incentivize them to fire a human being and buy a machine.
The structural rules of the game actively punish investments in human capability.
Yes.
And this brings us to a massive strategic contradiction within these organizations right now. Companies are leaning hard into this accounting bias.
Cutting personnel, stripping training budgets.
Exactly. And buying sophisticated artificial intelligence instead. But the successful integration of AI requires high-order cognitive skills from the human workforce.
Right, because someone has to actually run the AI.
Exactly. Employees need to be able to critically evaluate complex algorithmic outputs, they need to troubleshoot systems, and apply nuanced human judgment.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. The paper highlights a terrifying statistical collision.
Oh, the literacy data.
Yes, the technology demands advanced critical thinking, but current data shows that 45 to 55% of U.S. adults do not read at a proficient 12th grade level.
That is staggering.
It really is. There is a massive structural literacy and capability gap in the workforce. So if companies are systematically abandoning internal employee development right at the exact moment that their technological tools are becoming infinitely more complex, who's going to actually run these systems?
The short answer is nobody. They are entirely sabotaging their own future capabilities. Organizations have basically convinced themselves that treating labor as a disposable commodity is highly efficient. But the research proves this efficiency is a complete illusion.
It's fake efficiency.
Totally. Let's look at the real-world fallout of this decoupling, starting with the organizational costs. When a company executes a mass layoff to satisfy a quarterly target, they don't just lose bodies, they destroy institutional knowledge.
Right, the institutional knowledge. It's the invisible glue that holds the whole place together.
Exactly.
It's not just the data stored on the servers. It's the informal networks, the unwritten routines, the specific knowledge of which vendor to call when the supply chain randomly breaks down on a Tuesday.
Yes. And the financial penalty for destroying that knowledge is actually staggering. When the company inevitably realizes they cut too deep and attempts to rehire, replacing a single worker costs between 50 and 200% of that person's annual salary.
200%. That is insane.
You are paying for recruitment, onboarding, and literally months of lost productivity. The researcher Wayne Cascio conducted extensive longitudinal studies on this.
What did he find?
His data demonstrates that organizations utilizing layoffs as a primary cost-cutting strategy actually experienced negative effects on profitability in the subsequent years.
So it literally doesn't even work.
It backfires completely.
The burning furniture analogy perfectly captures the mechanism at play here. Doing a mass layoff to boost your quarterly stock price is exactly like chopping up your living room furniture and throwing it into the fireplace to stay warm for one single night.
That is a perfect way to visualize it.
Right. The fire blazes beautifully, the accountants are happy for the evening, but next month the blizzard is still raging and you have absolutely nowhere to sit. The house is completely empty.
And we cannot ignore what this dynamic does to the individuals trapped inside that house.
Oh, absolutely.
Beyond the financial precarity, over half of American workers lack the savings to cover just 3 weeks of living expenses.
3 weeks.
Yeah, but beyond that, there is a severe physiological toll. The chronic anxiety of job insecurity, the persistent fear that your skills are becoming obsolete, it triggers a perpetual fight-or-flight response.
Which destroys your body.
It does. The paper links this prolonged stress directly to measurable physical health damage, including significantly elevated rates of cardiovascular disease.
The human body is just not evolved to live in a state of perpetual threat regarding its basic survival.
Not at all.
And the ultimate irony here is that by violating the psychological contract to save a few dollars, organizations create an incredibly anxious, profoundly disconnected workforce.
Exactly.
If you know your company views you as a rental car, you don't treat the job with care. You don't wash a rental car. You don't change its oil. You drive it as hard as you can and hand back the keys.
That is spot on. And because workers naturally withhold their discretionary effort in a low-trust environment, the organization is forced to turn around and spend massive amounts of capital on surveillance.
Right, the monitoring software.
Oh, they invest heavily in employee monitoring software, rigid management hierarchies, and intense compliance controls just to squeeze baseline productivity out of a workforce that has entirely checked out.
So the cost of mistrust is astronomically high,
It is massive.
which perfectly transitions us to the core mission of this deep dive, the playbook for actually fixing it.
Yes, let's get into the solutions.
Because the research outlines an incredibly compelling alternative. Forward-thinking organizations recognize that the burning furniture strategy is a total dead end.
Right.
They are strategically recoupling with their workforce, and the financial returns are staggering. Let's look at how they are doing this, maybe starting with the foundation of basic physiological and financial safety. Look at the mechanics of Costco.
Costco is such a great example. They operate in a retail sector that is notorious for razor-thin margins, where competitors typically pay around $12 to $13 an hour.
Bare minimum.
Yeah. Conventional short-term retail accounting dictates that labor costs must be suppressed at all costs. But Costco flatly rejects that premise. They offer starting wages of $18 to $19 an hour, alongside robust, comprehensive benefits, even for part-time employees.
And the mechanism behind that choice drives their competitive advantage, right?
Absolutely.
Because by paying a premium, Costco virtually eliminates employee turnover, saving millions in continuous recruitment and training.
And they experience dramatically lower rates of inventory shrinkage or theft because a well-compensated, respected employee self-polices their environment.
They don't treat the store like a rental car.
Exactly. Moving up the hierarchy of needs, we look at psychological safety and procedural justice. The paper highlights Satya Nadella's transformative leadership at Microsoft.
Oh, the stack ranking thing.
Right. Prior to his tenure, Microsoft utilized a stack ranking system. Mechanically, this forced managers to grade employees on a curve.
So a certain percentage always had to fail.
Yeah, meaning a certain percentage of the team had to be ranked as underperformers completely regardless of actual output.
It is an engineered paranoia machine. Like, if helping my teammates succeed means I might end up in the bottom 10% and lose my job, well, I'm going to hoard information, sabotage my peers, and play extreme office politics.
Naturally. But Nadella dismantled that structure entirely. He replaced it with a culture optimized for psychological safety and transparency.
How did he do that?
He encouraged open dialogue about failures, and he shared difficult news early. By changing the systemic incentives from brutal internal competition to collaborative problem-solving, both employee engagement scores and Microsoft's market capitalization absolutely skyrocketed.
Wow. And that focus on transparent process brings up the concept of procedural justice, which General Motors demonstrated brilliantly during the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, that's a fascinating case study.
It really is. GM was facing total bankruptcy. The standard decoupling playbook says, lock the factory doors, file the paperwork, and let the chips fall where they may.
Right, preserve capital.
Exactly. But GM took a drastically different approach. They engaged in grueling, highly transparent negotiations with labor unions. They opened the books to show the exact nature of the existential threat facing the business.
And the outcome was still painful, obviously. Jobs were inevitably lost.
Yeah, they were.
But the mechanism of how they handled it matters. They developed voluntary separation packages and, crucially, utilized corporate funds to maintain displaced workers' health care benefits well beyond the legal requirements.
And that right there is procedural justice.
Exactly. The employees understood why the decisions were made and felt they were treated with dignity. By preserving that trust, GM protected its community reputation, ensuring they could successfully rehire top talent when the economic winds finally shifted back.
We also have to address the massive AI and literacy gap we discussed earlier. AT&T faced a similar existential skills crisis.
They really did.
As their core business rapidly transitioned toward cloud computing and data analytics, they realized a massive portion of their existing workforce possessed obsolete skills. The accounting ledgers told them to fire 100,000 legacy employees and just hire a new fleet of data scientists.
But AT&T chose capability building over capability buying.
Which is huge.
It is. They launched an initiative called Workforce 2020. They invested over $1 billion to map the future skills they required.
$1 billion.
Yeah. And then they provided their existing employees with tuition assistance, partnerships with universities, and clear internal pathways to reskill into those emerging technical roles. They signaled to their workforce that they were worth long-term investment.
And when we talk about long-term investment, the Lincoln Electric case study is absolutely wild.
Oh, I love this one.
They are a global manufacturing company that instituted a guaranteed employment policy back in 1958. They explicitly promised no layoffs for economic reasons. I read that and immediately wondered how on earth a manufacturing firm survives A massive demand shock, like the 2008 recession, without shedding payroll.
The mechanism that makes it work is structural flexibility.
Okay, how so?
Well, the psychological contract at Lincoln Electric is a two-way street. The company guarantees your job, but the worker guarantees their willingness to be aggressively redeployed.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so when the 2008 recession hit and orders plummeted, they didn't lay off the factory floor. Instead, they had production workers picking up phones to make direct sales calls, upgrading facility maintenance, and cross-training on new equipment.
They kept the institutional knowledge entirely intact.
Exact.
While their competitors were burning the furniture and losing their best talent, Lincoln Electric essentially split the recession, sharpening their tools. The minute the global economy recovered, they were primed to instantly scale production, while everyone else was desperately trying to recruit.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at the culmination of all these strategies,
Yeah.
which requires profound leadership vulnerability.
Vulnerability.
Yeah.
Right.
We saw this modeled by Marriott CEO Arne Sorensen during the initial COVID-19 lockdowns. The hospitality industry effectively went to zero revenue overnight.
Literally overnight.
And Sorensen released a remarkably raw, visibly emotional video to the entire global staff.
He didn't hide behind polished corporate PR jargon or legal disclaimers.
No, not at all.
He looked straight into the camera, explained the catastrophic reality of the math, and announced that he was taking zero salary.
Zero.
His executive team took massive pay cuts, and they channeled those savings to preserve the health care benefits of their furloughed workers for as long as mathematically possible.
And the result of that?
Employees surveyed during that period actually reported higher levels of trust in Marriott's leadership during the worst crisis in the company's history, simply because of how authentically and humanely the reality was communicated.
See, these case studies, Costco's baseline wages, Microsoft's psychological safety, AT&T's reskilling, Lincoln Electric's guarantees, Marriott's vulnerability, these are not nice-to-have social programs.
Right, they aren't charity.
No, they are aggressive, highly successful business strategies. These organizations are deliberately treating human capital as an appreciating asset. By offering stability and procedural justice, they purchase a level of discretionary effort, rapid innovation, and fierce loyalty that their competitors utilizing the disposable labor model literally cannot afford to replicate.
So what does this all mean for you as you navigate your own career? Think about the stark difference between the Wall Street layoff model and the Lincoln Electric model.
It's night and day.
It really is. Doing the supposedly expensive thing up front, paying a premium wage, refusing to conduct reactionary layoffs, investing heavily in continuous training, it is actually the ultimate cost-saving strategy when you zoom out to a 10-year timeline.
Because you aren't burning the furniture to hit a quarterly number?
Exactly. You're building a house that can actually withstand a hurricane.
The Great Decoupling wasn't a natural disaster. It represents an accumulation of deliberate choices made by organizational leadership over 60 years to prioritize short-term financial optics over long-term human capability.
Deliberate choices.
Yes. But the playbook of recoupling definitively proves that organizations still possess the agency to choose a completely different, vastly more sustainable path.
Let's recap the journey we've taken today. We started by examining the historic collapse of workplace trust, diagnosing the exhausting reality of the boundaryless Tinder date career where everyone is forced to hedge their bets with a side hustle.
Yeah.
Then we dug into the systemic mechanisms, from the 1980s shareholder primacy doctrines to the accounting quirks that bizarrely classify human beings as disposable period costs while treating machines as valuable investments.
Such a wild paradigm.
And finally, we explored the evidence-based playbook of transparent, high-investment employers who are actively proving that the psychological contract can be rebuilt and weaponized as a competitive advantage.
Absolutely.
I want you to evaluate your own workplace tomorrow morning. Look at the mechanisms around you. Are you operating in an environment that structurally treats you as a depreciating expense?
It's a tough question to ask.
It is, but you have to ask it. Are you constantly forced to independently hedge your financial bets because the floor feels unstable? Or is your organization actively investing in your continuous learning? Do they view your institutional knowledge as an appreciating asset?
This raises an important question regarding your own leverage, actually.
Oh, how so?
Understanding the architecture of the Great Decoupling provides you with absolute clarity on the landscape you are navigating.
Right.
You must maintain your individual career agency, actively develop portable skills, and build financial resilience. But you also possess the power to seek out, apply to, and reward the employers who are actively bucking these destructive trends.
Vote with your talent.
Exactly. Furthermore, never underestimate the power of collective voice to advocate for these sustainable, high-trust practices within the walls of your current company.
I love that. Well, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, something that really struck me when connecting the source material to where the world is heading.
Okay.
The paper repeatedly notes that AI is going to take over routine, programmable tasks, which currently puts a massive premium on complex human cognitive skills.
Right.
But let's fast forward 5 or 10 years. What happens when AI eventually automates those higher-level cognitive tasks and strategic planning, too?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right, because if the machines can eventually do all the data processing, all the market analysis, and all the logistical strategy.
Well, then what's left?
Exactly. The only genuine, irreplaceable competitive advantage left for any organization might be the deep, unquantifiable trust, the fierce loyalty, and the shared collaborative culture among the human beings running it.
Wow.
Ironically, the very human elements that the Great Decoupling has spent the last 60 years systematically destroying might be the absolute only things that could save organizations in the age of AI. Without that trust, you aren't building a company. You're just renting a fleet of cars waiting to break down.
It is a profound realization. In an increasingly automated world, the most critical, defensible asset of the future will simply be our humanity.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.